Hey, it's Pastor Doug, and I've got a great story for you. The doctor was out to lunch. He was mesmerized by the smell that was wafting up from the hot plate of green chili chicken enchiladas that had just been served to him. And as he was contemplating eating his favorite dish in the entire world, his cell phone rang. He didn't want to answer it. His mind and his heart and his nose told him that he needed to eat while he had the chance, but it kept ringing, and he was a doctor. Someone might be in trouble. And so he tapped the screen and he heard the voice of his faithful nurse, and she was panicked. She said, "Oh, doctor, you've got to rush back to the office as soon as you can. Why, there's a patient here with symptoms we've never seen before. You've got to get back here and help this poor little girl." Well, the doctor knew he didn't have a choice now, and so he called the waitress over and said, "Could you box this up for me and put it back in the back, and I'll pick it up on my way home." He'd done this before, and so she got ready for it, paid his bill, and he rushed back to the office. And when he got there, the nurse told him exactly what was going on. And the mother was waiting on the outside too, but he decided before he talked to the mother, he'd better see the little girl. And so he went into the exam room. She was lying rather still. And so he went inside. He'd taken off looking at her, saying, "Well, let's see what's going on with you." And she sat up and she began to smile sweetly. He checked her poise, and that smile widened into a grin. And whenever he looked into her eyes to see if everything was okay, she began to giggle and giggle, and she couldn't help herself, and she just kept giggling and giggling and giggling. And the doctor finally had to step out of the room. The nurse went back inside and settled her down. And the doctor went over to the mother and said, can you tell me when these symptoms began?" And the mother said, "Oh, it happened today, the very first day of fourth grade." "Well, how did things go?" "Well, seems to be okay to start with. I dropped her off as usual and made sure she was ready to go, and she took her new supplies and got in line with everyone else and went right on into the building." "Well, that sounds okay." "It was okay until I got the call from the nurse's office." "Got a call from the nurse's office?" "Yes. They'd said that she'd been having these fits of giggles all day and they didn't know what to do. And so you rushed down to the school." "I did." "And how was she when she got there?" "Well, she was in the nurse's office, and he said that she had settled down and that I'd better take this time to go talk to her teachers and I could come and get her later. And so that's exactly what I did." "Oh, what did the teacher say?" "Well, she said that in the morning Lauren came in and she was a model student. Why, she put all of her new school supplies exactly where they belonged, and she made friends with the other girls, and she was just being very polite, and everything was going just fine. In fact, the teacher was so impressed with her that she called Lauren to come up to the front of the classroom and be the first one to talk about her vacation. Why, she began talking about going to the Grand Canyon and going down on a donkey ride and all the things that we did this summer. And she talked about going to a 4th of July parade with her grandparents. And then a little boy in the front row asked her about where her grandparents lived. And she began to smile, and that smile widened into a grin, and she began to giggle and giggle and giggle, and she couldn't stop. She put her hands over her mouth, but it only made things worse. Miss Shelley, her teacher, had to tell her to get back down to her class, to go to the back of the room and put her head on the table, and she did. She was able to quiet down a little bit, but every time she looked up, she began to giggle and giggle. She couldn't stop. Why, Miss Shelley sent her to the office. The office? Yes, the principal's office. The principal's office. She just thought that Lauren was disrupting the class and being an impertinent little girl. Well, what did the principal do? Why, the principal brought her in and asked Lauren what was going on. Well, what did Lauren say? Well, she said she didn't know what was going on, but the principal, being the suspicious type, didn't believe her, and she lectured Lauren about being a proper young lady, about how she's not supposed to disrupt any of the classes, and that she expected more of her. Lauren was pretty sad about her behavior and said that she'd write an apology note to Miss Shelley, and the principal accepted that and sent her back to class. I assume it didn't go so well. She didn't get to class. Well, what happened? Well, she stopped at the water fountain and she got a great big gulp of water in her mouth, and she turned and noticed the fifth graders going into the library, and she began to smile. And that smile tightened and she couldn't swallow that water. And whenever that smile broke into a grin, everything was hard. And whenever she started to giggle, that water spewed everywhere. Those fifth graders had to run for their lives. The librarian wasn't very impressed. She took Lauren and marched her right back to the office. Oh, poor Lauren. What happened next? Well, the principal wasn't impressed with her at all. She sat Lauren down and asked for an explanation. She said, "Don't you remember you were going to be a proper young lady?" But Lauren couldn't help herself. She didn't know what was going on, and she just broke down in tears. She was crying, and the principal felt so bad that she sent her into the nurse's office. Well, what happened there? Well, she went into the waiting room, and when the nurse came back, he came in to check on her. Whenever he began to take her pulse, she began to smile. Whenever he looked into her eyes, she began to grin. And when he tried to take her temperature, she started giggling and giggling and giggling, and she couldn't stop herself. Whenever the nurse went out of the room to call me, the secretary went in, and she put a warm cloth on Lauren's eyes and laid her down, and she began to rest. She did? Yes, she did. Well, what happened then? Well, that's whenever I went out to call you. And whenever I got back to hearing all the things that happened, I asked the nurse if he would come in and check her one more time before we left for the day. And when we got in there and he began to check her, she did it all over again. And that's when I called your office for an emergency visit, and I'm so glad they worked us in. I understand that there was a commotion in the waiting room. There was. We got here and it seemed to be fine. And on the ride over, Lauren had settled down and seemed herself. But when we got into the waiting room, there was a little boy from her class that was waiting there too. And there wasn't any room for us to sit down. And so he scooched over for us to sit there. And whenever Lauren looked over at him, she began to smile. And she said, "Thank you very much." And she began to grin. And whenever he said, "Oh, it's okay, it was no problem," she began to giggle and giggle and giggle and giggle, and she couldn't stop herself. And the nurse came running out, and she took us and put us in the exam room. And I understand that she quietened down. She did. "Oh, doctor, what's wrong with my little girl?" And the doctor said, "I think I know exactly what's wrong with her. Why don't you go into the room with her, and I'm going to come in just a minute. We're going to perform a little experiment just to confirm my suspicions." And she said, "Okay," went on into the room with Lauren. Now, I'm sure that you've figured out exactly what Lauren was allergic to, haven't you? Well, the doctor talked to the nurse, and the nurse went to go get some medication for her. And as she did, the doctor opened the exam door, and he was greeted by such a sweet smile. And as he came and put his chair next to Lauren, it widened into a grin. And as he tried to say, "Well, can you open your mouth and say, aw," she began to giggle and laugh and giggle, and she couldn't stop herself. And the nurse came in with a spoonful of this murky looking medicine, and the doctor grabbed it and shoved it right in Lauren's mouth. And she stopped giggling. And his mama said, "Oh, doctor, what's the matter with my little girl?" And the doctor said, "Oh, I'm afraid to tell you that she's allergic." Allergic? Well, doctor, what she's allergic to? "I'm afraid that she's allergic to boys." Allergic to boys? Yes. Well, is there anything we can do about it? Oh, certainly there is. Well, in the morning, you'll probably have to give her some chocolate and maybe some of her lunch to help her out through the day. And if it's a particularly bad case, you might have to greet her at the end of school with a popsicle. And on those bad occasions when she's really allergic, you might have to feed her ice cream for breakfast. Oh, doctor, is there anything else? Is she's going to be this way her whole life? No, don't worry about that. This is just a childhood disease. Why, most girls get over it on their wedding day. Their wedding day, her mama said. That's going to take forever. Well, it might be. It'll come and go, but you'll figure out how to take care of her just fine. Oh, what am I going to do? Well, to be honest, you need to make sure that the principal knows exactly what's going on. And so you should send her a note that Lauren can hand her tomorrow morning. And so, on the second day of fourth grade, Lauren came to school and went straight to the principal's office. And with just a bare hint of a smile on her face, she handed the principal a note. And she read it. It said, "I am so sorry for disrupting the class yesterday and the school. I'm ashamed of myself, but it's not entirely my fault. My mom took me to the doctor and he said that I'm allergic and it was a reaction that I was having. But he's given me some medication and a treatment and I shouldn't be disruptive anymore. I really will make sure that it doesn't happen again." And the principal looked up from reading the note and said, Lauren, it doesn't say here what you're allergic to, so can you tell me exactly what you're allergic to?" "Well, I'm afraid that it's highly contagious. The doctor said that the other girls might be exposed. I'm so sorry. I really am. Everyone's going to be acting the same way." And she said, "Oh no, not a pandemic. Oh, you've got to tell me, what are you allergic to?" "I'm allergic to boys." And the principal began to smile. She was allergic too. And I tell you that story because God has created us in such a way that boys are kind of allergic to girls in the same way that girls can be allergic to boys. But he has a plan so that this allergy will be complete on that day when we learn to live his way and we begin our own families. And that's the end of that.